It had been months since my husband and I had shared even a fleeting moment of true closeness. The kind of intimacy we once held as a given now seemed like a fragile relic of a different life. My pregnancy, now nearing its final stages, stood like an unspoken barrier between us, a constant reminder of how much had changed, how much we had changed. Every night, as I lay awake, the weight of my growing belly pressing into the mattress, I felt the vast, yawning space between us. He would turn over, his back to me, and I would stare at the ceiling, wondering how we had gotten here. The physical distance felt insurmountable, but the emotional distance was worse. I couldn't bear it anymore. Tonight, I told myself, things would be different. I stood in front of the mirror, my hands trembling slightly as I adjusted the straps of the lingerie I had carefully chosen. It was the one he used to love, soft, delicate, and just revealing enough to make me feel like myself again, not just a vessel carrying our child. I traced a finger along the lace hem, breathing deeply to calm the nerves fluttering in my chest. The woman staring back at me wasn't the same as before. My face was fuller, my body softer, and my eyes carried a weariness that hadn't been there before. But underneath it all, I still recognized a spark of the woman I used to be, the woman who used to captivate him. The sound of the front door opening made my heart leap. I quickly blew out the last of the candles on the dresser, leaving just a few flickering softly around the room. My pulse quickened as I stepped into the hallway to greet him. He stood in the entryway, his jacket slung over one arm, his tie loosened, and his posture heavy with fatigue. His eyes barely lifted to meet mine as I approached. "Hey," I said softly, trying to infuse my voice with warmth and playfulness. "Hey," he replied, his tone flat, his eyes distant. I swallowed the lump forming in my throat and reached for his hand, entwining my fingers with his. "Come with me," I whispered, pulling him gently toward the bedroom. He hesitated for a moment, glancing toward the kitchen as though considering whether to pour himself a drink instead. But he let me guide him, his steps slow and reluctant. The bedroom glowed in the soft light of the candles, the shadows they cast moving gently across the walls like a silent dance. I felt a flicker of hope as he stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the room before landing on me. "Do you remember this?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "The way we used to be?" He didn't answer, but I caught the faintest softening in his expression. Slowly, I stepped closer, sliding my arms around his neck, drawing him toward me. His hands rested tentatively on my waist, and for a moment, we were suspended in the fragile warmth of the moment. We laughed over something small, a shared memory or a silly comment, and for a brief, shimmering instant, it felt like the past wasn't so far away. But then, like a glass slipping from a careless grip, it all shattered. "I feel like I don't exist to you anymore," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. My voice cracked, betraying the rawness of the emotion I had been holding back for weeks. "I don't feel wanted. I don't feel loved." His jaw tightened, and he stepped back, his hands falling to his sides. "You think this has been easy for me," he shot back, his tone sharp. "You're not the only one struggling. I can't be everything all the time, I need space." The words stung, each one cutting deeper than the last. I opened my mouth to respond, but he was already reaching for his jacket. "I'm going to the club," he said, his voice flat and final. He didn't even look at me as he pulled the door open. "Don't wait up." The door closed behind him with a dull thud, leaving me standing in the middle of the candlelit room, the silence pressing in around me. I sank onto the edge of the bed, wrapping my arms around my belly as tears slipped silently down my cheeks. The lace of my lingerie felt suddenly ridiculous, a futile attempt to bridge a gap that felt wider now than ever before. Morning arrived reluctantly, its pale light creeping through the cracks in the curtains and casting long shadows on the walls. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the oppressive quiet of the house. The faint sounds of birds chirping outside felt distant, almost unreal, as if they belonged to a world separate from mine. I reached out instinctively, my hand brushing against the cool, empty sheet beside me. He wasn't there. His side of the bed hadn't been touched. My fingers lingered for a moment before I pulled them back, the chill seeping into my chest. My throat felt tight as I checked my phone, still no messages, no missed calls, just the same silence that had followed him out the door last night. The argument replayed in my head, each word sharper and heavier than before. I could almost hear the finality in the way he had said, "Don't wait up," as if he knew he wouldn't be coming home. Sitting up slowly, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and rested my hands on my belly, feeling the faint movements of life within me. It was a small comfort, but even that seemed overshadowed by the loneliness pressing down on me. I couldn't stay here, not like this, surrounded by the ghost of his absence. I forced myself to get dressed, pulling on a loose sweater and a pair of jeans that still fit. The act of getting ready felt mechanical, each motion deliberate and devoid of thought. I decided to go to the supermarket, not because I truly needed anything, but because I needed to escape the suffocating stillness of the house. The cold air stung my cheeks as I stepped outside, the ground damp from the rain that had fallen during the night. The walk to the store was brisk and uneventful, my breath forming small clouds in the chilly morning. I kept my eyes on the ground, my mind a swirling mess of emotions I didn't know how to sort through. When I finally arrived, the warmth of the supermarket wrapped around me like a fragile shield. The familiar buzz of activity, the clattering of carts, the faint hum of conversation, was oddly comforting. I grabbed a basket and began wandering through the aisles, barely paying attention to what I was picking up. I stopped in front of the milk display, reaching out absently for a carton, when I felt a gentle tap on my shoulder. "Excuse me," a voice said from behind me. I turned to find a man holding a small grocery list. He was tall, with kind eyes and a soft smile that immediately put me at ease. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and there was a warmth in his gaze that caught me off guard. "I think you dropped this," he said, holding the list out to me. I blinked, then glanced down at the crumpled piece of paper in his hand. It wasn't mine, but I nodded anyway, taking it from him with a murmured, "Thank you." "You're welcome," he said, his smile lingering. He hesitated for a moment before adding, "You look like you've got a lot on your mind." I let out a small, hollow laugh. "That obvious?" "Not really," he said gently. "Just a hunch." There was something disarming about his tone, his presence. I found myself responding without the usual guardedness that had become second nature lately. "It's been a rough few days," I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. He nodded, his expression understanding. "Sometimes it helps to talk about it. Even to a stranger." For reasons I couldn't quite explain, I started talking. As we walked slowly through the aisles, I told him about my husband's growing distance, the argument that had left me feeling hollow, and the endless loneliness that seemed to fill every corner of my life. The words spilled out of me like water from a broken dam, and he listened without interrupting, his attention unwavering. His name was Alfred, and there was a quiet steadiness about him that made it easy to let my guard down. He wasn't pushy, nor did he offer empty platitudes. He simply listened, nodding occasionally, his soft expressions of empathy grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. By the time we reached the end of the store, I felt a strange lightness in my chest, as though the act of speaking had lifted some of the weight I had been carrying. Alfred stopped near the checkout line and turned to face me fully, his hand resting lightly on the handle of his cart. "You don't have to carry all of this alone," he said softly, his voice steady. "If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." His words were simple but profound, a lifeline tossed to me in the middle of an emotional storm. Before I could respond, he took a step closer and gently pulled me into an embrace. His arms were warm and steady, and for a moment, I allowed myself to relax into his touch, closing my eyes against the tears threatening to spill. But then, a sharp, searing pain tore through my abdomen. I gasped, clutching my belly as the world around me tilted. The warmth of Alfred's arms disappeared as my knees buckled beneath me. "Are you okay?" I heard his voice, distant and frantic, as another wave of pain radiated through me. My vision blurred, the fluorescent lights above swimming as I struggled to stay upright. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Alfred's face, his eyes wide with concern. When I awoke, the world was brighter and sharper, filled with the sterile smell of antiseptic and the rhythmic beeping of monitors. I blinked against the harsh light and turned my head slowly, my body heavy and weak. "You're awake," a nurse said, her voice calm and soothing as she adjusted something near my bed. "You've given birth to a healthy baby boy. Congratulations." Relief washed over me like a tidal wave, and tears spilled freely down my cheeks as I reached for my son. His tiny body felt impossibly fragile in my arms, but his warmth was a balm to my fractured heart. Through the doorway, I saw Alfred standing with a bouquet of flowers, his kind smile returning as he stepped into the room. He placed the bouquet on the small table beside me and sat in the chair near the bed. "I'm glad you're okay," he said quietly, his gaze flickering to the baby in my arms. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel completely alone. Alfred sat beside me in the hospital room, his chair pulled close to my bed. The sterile white walls seemed to fade into the background as we spoke softly, our voices no more than murmurs over the quiet hum of the machines. I cradled my son, his tiny fingers curling around mine, and found myself opening up in ways I hadn't before. "He hasn't answered any of my calls," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know if he knows about the baby." Alfred's brow furrowed, his eyes full of sympathy. He leaned in slightly, his presence steady, a source of calm amidst the turmoil swirling inside me. "You don't have to go through this alone," he said gently, his voice wrapping around me like a soft blanket. Then, as if testing the fragile connection between us, he leaned closer, his lips brushing against mine in a fleeting, tender kiss. I froze for a moment, my heart thudding in my chest. His touch was gentle, his intent clear, comfort, not conquest. When he pulled back, his gaze searched mine for a reaction. I didn't say anything, but I didn't pull away either. The room felt impossibly quiet, the air thick with unspoken words. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of recovery and the quiet Macy of Alfred's visits. He came every day, bringing small things, flowers, fresh fruit, a soft blanket for the baby. Each time, his presence brought with it a sense of reassurance, a steady anchor in a life that felt increasingly adrift. He was there for the sleepless nights, holding my son when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me. He listened when I spoke of my fears and doubts, offering words of encouragement and understanding. When the day came for me to be discharged, Alfred was the one who brought me home. His car was warm and smelled faintly of lavender, a calming contrast to the biting cold outside. The drive was quiet but not uncomfortable, we didn't need to fill the silence with meaningless chatter. As he helped me carry my things into the house, I was struck by how empty it felt. The rooms seemed colder, the silence heavier, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the tension of the past few weeks. I placed the baby's car seat on the couch and began unpacking, my movements slow and deliberate. On the kitchen table, I noticed a folded piece of paper. My heart sank as I recognized my husband's handwriting. With trembling hands, I unfolded the note and read its brief, impersonal message. "I've gone to visit family for a while. I need time to think. Don't contact me." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I sank into the nearest chair, clutching the note as tears welled in my eyes. The finality of his absence, the deliberate distance he was putting between us, felt like a door slamming shut. Alfred appeared in the doorway, his expression shifting as he saw me clutching the note. He stepped closer, his brow furrowed in concern. "What's wrong?" he asked softly. I handed him the note without a word, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. He read it quickly, his lips pressing into a thin line as he set it back on the table. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice low but steady. He knelt beside me, placing a hand on my knee. "You don't deserve this, not after everything you've been through." I wiped at my tears, feeling a mix of anger, hurt, and profound sadness. "I don't know how to do this," I whispered. "I don't know how to hold it all together." Alfred's hand tightened gently on my knee. "You're stronger than you think," he said. "And you're not alone. I'm here, for as long as you need me." His words were sincere, his presence grounding, but they didn't erase the ache in my chest. I nodded silently, my gaze falling to the tiny bundle on the couch. My son stirred, his small face scrunching up before he settled back into sleep. "I'll help you," Alfred continued, his voice unwavering. "We'll take it one day at a time." The house was still, the kind of stillness that felt oppressive, yet Alfred's presence softened its edges. Though the note lay heavy on the table, a symbol of everything that was breaking apart, Alfred's hand on my knee reminded me that not everything had to crumble. The house felt heavier with each passing day. Silence had taken on a physical weight, settling into every corner, pressing down on me as I went about the motions of caring for my son. My husband's absence was a wound that refused to heal, and the note he'd left behind was like salt poured over it, a stark reminder that I had been abandoned, left to fend for myself at the most vulnerable time of my life. At first, I tried to push through the pain by focusing on my baby. His tiny face was a constant reminder of the love I'd once believed was unshakable. But even his innocent coos couldn't mask the gnawing ache in my chest. The days dragged on, each one blending into the next, until I no longer had the energy to hide the dark cloud that hung over me. Alfred's visits became my only reprieve. He always arrived with something in hand, a box of diapers, a bag of groceries, or even just a bouquet of flowers to brighten the dull, lifeless house. But more than the gifts, it was his presence that kept me from sinking entirely into despair. He had a way of listening that made me feel seen, a rare and precious gift when I was otherwise invisible to the world. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the kitchen table, steam curling up from our mugs of tea, the dam finally broke. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. I kept my eyes fixed on the tea swirling in my cup, unable to meet his gaze. "I'm exhausted, Alfred. Physically, emotionally, financially, I'm running on empty." He didn't interrupt, just nodded quietly, urging me to continue. "I don't know where to turn," I admitted, my voice cracking. "The bills are piling up, and with him gone, I don't even know if I can keep the lights on next month." I swallowed hard, the tears threatening to spill. "I feel like I'm drowning." Alfred leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. His expression was serious, but there was no pity in his eyes, only quiet understanding. "I've been thinking about how I can help," he said gently. "You're right, this isn't sustainable. But there's a way to make things easier. It's not a simple solution, though, and it's something you'll have to think carefully about." I looked up at him, confusion and curiosity mingling in my gaze. "What do you mean?" Alfred hesitated for a moment, as if carefully choosing his words. "There's a way for you to earn money, enough to take care of yourself and the baby. But it's unconventional. It's not for everyone, and it would require a lot of trust." My stomach tightened, and I set my cup down, my hands trembling slightly. "What exactly are you suggesting?" He reached across the table, placing his hand gently over mine. "I know people," he said carefully, "who are willing to pay for companionship, for company. It's not what you might think, and you set the boundaries, and nothing happens without your consent. But it's good money, and it could give you the stability you need right now." I froze, his words hanging in the air between us like a heavy fog. The implications were clear, but I wasn't sure I was ready to face them. "I don't know," I murmured, pulling my hand back. My chest tightened, a mix of fear and uncertainty clawing at me. "I've never even thought about something like that." "I understand," Alfred said softly. "It's a lot to take in, and I don't want you to feel pressured. But I want you to know that you wouldn't be doing this alone. I'd be here, and we'd make sure everything was safe. I'd install cameras around the house, discreetly, to monitor everything and ensure your safety." His voice was calm, steady, as if he'd thought this through 100 times before. "This would give you control over your life again," he continued. "You'd decide who comes into your home and what happens. And you'd finally have the financial freedom you need." I sat back, my mind reeling. The kitchen felt too small, the walls closing in as the weight of his suggestion settled over me. I couldn't deny the logic in what he was saying. I needed money, and fast. But the thought of opening my home, my life, to strangers, it terrified me. Alfred seemed to sense my hesitation. He stood, moving around the table to kneel beside me. "I'm not saying you have to decide right now," he said softly, his hand resting lightly on my knee. "Take your time. Think about it. And whatever you decide, I'll support you." Before I could respond, he leaned in and kissed me, a gentle, lingering kiss that seemed to hold both reassurance and promise. Then, he stood and left, leaving me alone with my thoughts. That night, I lay awake, the baby's soft breathing the only sound in the quiet house. Alfred's words played on a loop in my mind, intertwining with the fear of losing everything and the desperate need to provide for my son. The days turned into weeks, and I wrestled with the decision. Every time I thought about saying yes, a wave of shame and doubt washed over me. But then I'd look at my son, his tiny hand clutching my finger, and the resolve in my chest would harden. Finally, I called Alfred and told him I was ready to talk. We met at a small cafe, its warm, inviting atmosphere a stark contrast to the heavy conversation that lay ahead. Alfred wasted no time explaining the details. "There will be clients, men, who come to you for companionship," he said, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. "You'll have control over every interaction. No one can force you to do anything you're not comfortable with. And as I mentioned, the house will be monitored. I'll be nearby if anything goes wrong." His tone was reassuring, but the enormity of what he was suggesting left my stomach in knots. "And the money?" I asked, my voice quiet but steady. "You'll be compensated generously for your time," Alfred replied. "Enough to cover your expenses, and then some." I nodded slowly, my hands clenching around the edge of the table. "And my son? He won't be involved in any of this." "Of course not," Alfred assured me. "His safety and well-being come first. You'll have complete control over when and where these interactions take place." The conversation lasted well into the evening, and by the time we parted ways, I felt both relieved and terrified. I had made my decision, but the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty. That night, as I rocked my son to sleep, I stared out into the darkness beyond the window. My heart was heavy, but my resolve was firm. This was the choice I had to make, not for myself, but for him. The day Michael was scheduled to arrive, my nerves were on edge. I had spent the morning cleaning the house, scrubbing every surface as if I could erase the anxiety clinging to me. The baby slept peacefully in his crib, unaware of the weight of the decision his mother had made. When the knock came at the door, I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. For a moment, I considered not answering, but then I thought of the envelope Alfred had said Michael would bring, the lifeline that would keep the lights on and food on the table. I couldn't back out now. I carefully placed my son in his crib and locked the door to the nursery. I lingered there for a moment, my hand on the doorknob, whispering a silent promise to him, "This is for you. Everything I do is for you." When I opened the front door, Michael stood there, holding a small envelope. He looked to be in his early 40s, with a neatly trimmed beard and kind, tired eyes. His demeanor was calm but reserved, and when he smiled, it was with a faint awkwardness, as though he wasn't sure how to begin. "Hello," he said softly, handing me the envelope. "I'm Michael." "Come in," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. I gestured for him to enter, closing the door quietly behind him. The air in the living room felt heavy as I led him to the couch. He sat down, his movements deliberate and unhurried, while I remained standing, unsure of what to do next. "You don't have to be nervous," he said, his voice gentle, as though he could read my thoughts. "This is new for both of us." I nodded, offering a faint smile before stepping into the kitchen. I returned with 2 glasses of water, setting one in front of him. He accepted it with a polite nod, but neither of us drank. Finally, after a moment of silence, he spoke. "I'd like a private performance," he said, his tone respectful but direct. I took a deep breath, reminding myself of Alfred's words, "You're in control. You set the boundaries." I nodded, then walked to the center of the room, where the dining table stood. Standing there, I felt exposed, even though I was still fully clothed. The thought of dancing for a stranger was surreal, but I pushed through the discomfort. Slowly, I began to move, swaying to a rhythm only I could hear. My hands brushed the surface of the table as I stepped up onto it, my body finding a fluidity I didn't know I possessed. Michael watched quietly, his gaze steady but not invasive. There was a sadness in his eyes that became more pronounced as the minutes passed. He didn't clap or cheer, he simply watched, his hands resting on his lap. When I finally stopped, the room was filled with a heavy silence. I climbed down from the table, brushing my hands against my sides nervously. You're very graceful, he said softly, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. Thank you for that. He took a long sip of water, then leaned back on the couch, his gaze distant. I lost my wife last year, he said abruptly, his words hanging in the air. She loved to dance. Watching you, it reminded me of her. I didn't know what to say, so I stayed quiet, letting him speak. He told me about her, how they'd met, the life they'd built together, and the emptiness her absence had left behind. His words were laced with pain, but there was also a quiet strength in the way he spoke. When he finished, he stood and walked over to me, placing a hand gently on my shoulder. Thank you, he said again, his voice low. Then, almost as an afterthought, he leaned in and kissed me, softly, briefly, a gesture that felt more like a farewell than anything else. After he left, I sat on the couch, staring at the envelope he'd given me. Inside was more money than I had expected. I held it in my hands for a long time, feeling a mix of relief and unease. The next day, I went out and bought a few things, a warm sweater, a set of soft blankets for the baby, and a small vase for the kitchen table. They were modest luxuries, but they felt like small victories, a way of reclaiming a bit of normalcy in the chaos of my new reality. Not long after, Alfred informed me that another client, Ethan, would be coming. I spent the hours leading up to his arrival in a similar haze of nervous preparation, though this time the anticipation felt slightly different. Michael's visit had left me with a strange sense of peace, as though I had crossed an invisible threshold. When Ethan arrived, his demeanor was markedly different from Michael's. He was younger, perhaps in his early 30s, with sharp features and a quiet intensity. His smile was polite but guarded, and he carried himself with a seriousness that made the atmosphere feel heavier. Thank you for having me, he said as he stepped inside. We sat on the couch, exchanging small talk at first. Unlike Michael, Ethan didn't ask for a performance. Instead, he suggested watching a movie together. I hesitated, but he reassured me with a faint smile. Something light, he said. No pressure. I chose a romantic comedy from the shelf, and as the film played, we sat side by side, the silence between us punctuated by the occasional laugh or comment. At first, I was hyper-aware of the distance between us, but as the movie progressed, I found myself relaxing. Our hands brushed a few times as we reached for the popcorn bowl, and each accidental touch sent a small jolt through me. It wasn't unpleasant, it was just unexpected. There was something unspoken in the air, a quiet connection that neither of us acknowledged but both seemed to feel. Toward the end of the movie, Ethan turned to me, his expression softer than before. Thank you for this, he said quietly. It's been a long time since I've felt normal. I nodded, understanding more than I could articulate. He leaned in, his lips brushing mine gently, tentatively, as if testing the waters. Unlike Michael's kiss, Ethan's was lingering, filled with an almost palpable sadness. When he pulled away, he didn't speak, and neither did I. After he left, his presence lingered in the quiet house. I found myself thinking about our brief conversation, the way his hand had felt brushing against mine, the sadness in his kiss. I wasn't sure what to make of the path I was on, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a faint glimmer of control, a sense that I could shape my future, even if only in small ways. With each visit, I became more accustomed to the life I was building, though it was far from the one I had envisioned. The nervousness that had gripped me at first began to fade, replaced by a strange sense of control over my circumstances. The money I earned was steady, and my once empty house gradually filled with new things, a sleek coffee maker, soft rugs for the floors, clothes that fit my post-pregnancy body better. Yet, no matter how many beautiful things I surrounded myself with, there was a void that no amount of money could fill. My husband's absence loomed over everything. Every day, I would catch myself glancing at my phone, hoping for a text or a missed call that never came. I imagined him with his family, perhaps thinking about me, but as the weeks stretched on, that hope felt increasingly foolish. Alfred continued to visit regularly, his steady presence an anchor in my unpredictable world. He always arrived with a quiet smile and a practical gift, diapers, formula, or something for the house. But despite his kindness, I began to notice a subtle shift in him. There was a tension in his gaze, a growing sense of expectation that I couldn't quite place. One evening, just as I was settling my son into his crib, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, Alfred stood there, his usual calm demeanor intact. But behind him were Michael and Ethan, their expressions unreadable. "Is something wrong?" I asked, my voice tinged with confusion. "No," Alfred said smoothly, stepping inside. "We just thought we'd spend some time together tonight. Something different." The air felt heavy as the three of them entered the living room. I closed the door behind them, my instincts prickling with unease. Alfred set a bottle of wine on the table, its dark glass catching the light, and gestured for me to sit. Michael and Ethan exchanged a glance, their movements deliberate as they sat down on either side of me. The atmosphere was different, charged with something I couldn't yet define. Alfred poured the wine, handing me a glass before raising his own in a silent toast. I hesitated, but the weight of their collective gaze left me no choice. I sipped the wine, its bitter taste coating my tongue. The conversation started light, reminiscing about Michael's late wife, joking about the absurdity of the movie Ethan and I had watched. But as the night wore on, their demeanor began to change. Alfred stood and reached into his bag, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. The clink of metal against metal sent a chill down my spine. "We thought we'd try something new tonight," he said, his voice smooth but with an edge I hadn't heard before. My heart raced, and I shot a glance at the door, calculating the distance between me and escape. But before I could react, Michael placed a firm hand on my wrist, his grip gentle yet unyielding. "Relax," Alfred said, pouring another glass of wine. "We're just having a little fun." Ethan leaned closer, his hand brushing a strand of hair from my face. "You trust us, don't you?" he asked softly. I felt trapped, their presence suffocating. The wine blurred my thoughts, dulling the alarm bells ringing in my head. I wanted to resist, to tell them to leave, but my body refused to move, heavy and uncooperative. The night passed in a haze of shadows and fragmented moments. I remembered laughter that didn't feel like mine, hands that lingered too long, and the metallic cold of the handcuffs against my skin. Somewhere in the blur, my resolve crumbled, and I felt myself slipping into a place where time had no meaning. When dawn broke, I awoke to the faint sound of birds chirping outside the window. My head throbbed, and my body felt foreign, as if it didn't belong to me. The first thing I noticed was the wads of cash on the nightstand, their crisp edges catching the morning light. I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched them, the weight of what they represented pressing down on me. The second thing I noticed was the empty house. Alfred, Michael, and Ethan were gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of cologne and the lingering taste of regret. I stood on shaky legs and made my way to the nursery. My son lay peacefully in his crib, his tiny face serene in sleep. A wave of emotion surged through me, love, guilt, despair, and an overwhelming need to protect him. Leaning over the crib, I brushed a gentle hand over his soft cheek and whispered, "I'm doing this for you. To survive." The words felt hollow, even as I said them. I wanted to believe that this sacrifice, this life I had chosen, was for his benefit. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing pieces of myself with every decision I made. The money would keep us afloat, I reminded myself. It would buy him clothes, food, and a warm place to sleep. But as I stood there, watching my son breathe softly, I couldn't ignore the gnawing question in the back of my mind, at what cost? The sunlight filtered through the curtains, bathing the room in a soft glow, but it did little to chase away the shadows that lingered within me. The void left by my husband remained, a silent chasm that no amount of money or fleeting connections could fill. I was surviving, yes, but survival felt like a hollow victory when the cost was my soul.